views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Bronx Buzz. We have a really good show for you, as we always do. As you might know, this is our program where we take an inside look at Bronx reporters. We normally do a Bronx roundtable, and I have the roundtable here, but today both of our reporters are going to be from somewhere else, specifically on Skype. From various places. We're going to be joined by two reporters today. The first will be Abigail Savitz-Lew from City Limits, and also a little later in the show we'll be joined by Patrick Rocchio, who is the assignment editor at the Bronx Times Reporter. So we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about zonings. We're going to talk about some of the local issues in the Bronx, like Rodman's Neck and Pelham Parkway. But let's start off the program and zip by magic all the way down to Lower Manhattan and say hello to our buddy Abigail Savitz-Lew from City Limits. Abigail, nice to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Hey Gary, it's so good to join you.
Before we get into some of the specifics, and I know you've become a zonings expert and a rezoning expert, I want to talk about something that you brought up, I think the last time you were here, and that is this whole idea of City Limits having zonein.org, which is specifically designed for people to get information about the rezonings. So tell me about zonein.org, and then we'll break it down with some of the specifics.
Great, yeah, we launched this new site in the fall, and basically we are documenting what is happening in all of the about a dozen neighborhoods that are considering some sort of rezoning. And in some of those neighborhoods, the mayor is pushing a rezoning. In other neighborhoods, maybe it's like the local council member or even sometimes a community groups that are pushing for a rezoning of some sort. So we cover both news from those areas, and we also publish op-eds and important documents and dates of important meetings. So that includes two rezonings in proposed rezonings in the Bronx. One would be the well-known Jerome Avenue proposed rezoning, and the other is a sort of a study of the Southern Boulevard area that is expected to lead to a rezoning proposal.
I'm going to give you I guess, a sitting ovation. I can't stand up here because of the limitations of what we're doing, but it's a very important thing, because when changes come to people's communities, and especially in this day and age where people are worried about gentrification, they're worried about all different kinds of issues that come up in here, it's very difficult to get information. And so I wanted to just remind viewers, zonein.org is where you can go to not only read what Abigail's writing, but all the things that she just talked about. So let's talk about one of the articles that you wrote, which I think is fascinating, because we were talking about it here where BronxNet has new studios at Mercy College at the Hutch Metro Center. And when this beautiful complex was built, there was a lot of talk about traffic and transportation. What is the infrastructure being put in place? We talk about, and I know people in Jerome Avenue, in the Jerome Avenue study, were very worried about transportation infrastructure. You've got an article here that is a fascinating article about school seats. Talk to me about the issue with school seats and why that is relevant in the dialogue about rezonings.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. So all these rezonings that are going on, that are being proposed, I hear in many neighborhoods concerns about that, once there's all this new development of new housing, there is just not going to be enough school seats to accommodate the increased population. A lot of times people will say, oh, my district is already overcrowded. How can you possibly allow a rezoning which will increase housing density and not build a new school? Or sometimes, like in East New York, where a rezoning has already been passed, the city said, we will build a new school. And the people in the neighborhood says, no, we want 4 to 6 new schools because we already see overcrowding. So I took a look at at kind of how the city has been analyzing the impacts of rezonings and population growth on school seats. And I sort of feel like what I'm seeing is that the problem goes much farther beyond the rezoning environmental review analysis, meaning that uh, basically, like, I'm just going to use East New York as an example because they haven't done the same analysis for the Bronx rezonings yet, although those will be forthcoming. But in East New York, the city said, like, okay, here there's going to be a lot of population growth very quickly, and so we'll build a new school there. Yes, we can plan for that now. That makes sense. Over here, well, yes, there's also going to be a lot of population growth, and it's going to happen more gradually, but it is going to be a significant adverse impact that we have to identify publicly. But we're not going to do anything about it. And that's because, well, we'll just watch and make sure everything's okay down the line. And if down the line we need a new school, then we'll build one. But, people are very distrusting that will actually happen. And it makes sense because, people both question how the school, how the city, how the DOE, how the Department of Ed analyzes school overcrowding. They don't trust that measure. And they also don't trust the school construction authority, their method of planning for new school seats in the city as a whole.
Partially, while I understand philosophically what you're saying, and it's very important that we have, a big plan when we're talking about zonings in the city, but part of the problem is if you look at, let's say, a rezoning that's going to happen, and then, maybe this is step one or phase one, and then phase two will come a little bit later, you might not know the budgeting in 5 years or 10 years. So you could even say, and now, on some level, I suppose, excuse me, on some level, I'm giving the city a bit of a pass. They're saying, well, you can't plan because, great, you're going to say we'll build 2 more new schools, but those are not going to be built for 5 years from now, 10 years from now. You could have a whole new city council. You could have a whole new mayor. Certainly you could have a new president. You don't know what is going on as far as the funding. So you could promise the schools, but where's the beef? Who's going to pay for it? That's a big issue, right?
Oh, that is such a good point, and I think the city would argue not only is there uncertainty in the future, but also there's a lot of schools that are overcrowded right now, and in fact, East New York, by some measures, isn't the most overcrowded district. So they would argue, we need to plan for these schools in Bensonhurst and in Queens that are really crowded now. But I think that one thing the city might be able to look at and perhaps improve is just sort of how the process for talking about what those future needs are going to be. Because we do need to have a good system for understanding, and we need to agree about what kind of needs are going to be needed to fulfill in the future, even if we can't really budget for them now.
It's a really good point. And in my many years of doing broadcasting here in the Bronx, this has come up time and again. And the concept is urban planning. We make an urban plan, but it's for 1 year, 2 years. It'd be nice to, and of course I'm always looking at the Bronx map. When I go like this, that's Bronx map. That we're looking at, I'd like to look at, the Bronx map and, for example, Yankee Stadium, it wasn't necessarily a rezoning, but they took a very limited view of, well, we'll trade parkland for this and that kind of thing without taking a step back and looking at the growth of the whole community. And in the Jerome Avenue study, which is certainly farther along than in the Southern Boulevard study, the first thing that came up was the crowded number 4 train. You're going to put a lot of people there. You're going to ask people to move back and forth. You're also going to hopefully bring in restaurants or new amenities on Jerome Avenue. But how are you going to move people in and out? Are you going to increase trains? And to me, it seems like what we would need to do, and I am not an urban planner, but just a big mouth journalist, what we would need to do is make a list and say, well, transportation, school seats, et cetera, and at least put out what we need. Sounds to me like they're kind of saying, well, we don't want the plan to not fly because so let's just deal with it down the road. That's not a great way of operating, I suppose.
It's a really interesting issue you bring up, because I think that in each of these rezoning neighborhoods, there definitely is an effort by the de Blasio administration's many different agencies to come together and talk about, okay, what are the needs, transport needs, school needs, streetscaping needs in each of these neighborhoods. But yeah, the question of kind of long-term planning and a sort of citywide planning or sort of multiple neighborhoods at once, multiple boroughs at once. I think there are definitely there are advocates and urban planners who kind of crave, some sort of more citywide exercise, and that's something that New York City hasn't done in since the '60s, I think, and other cities do it. They do 30-year planning exercises, and that's not something that that our government has.
That we've been able to do for a variety of reasons. I mean, we could pick it, Mayor Giuliani, Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor de Blasio, but it's a mix of things. You have written about rezonings on Staten Island and also about in Rockaway. Obviously, that has some relevance or some interest to people in the Bronx. What I think would be interesting, are there similarities or differences or something that you can relate from what you have written about in those rezonings that could be relevant to the Jerome Avenue study or even what might be coming down the pike on Southern Boulevard?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that there are definitely issues that overlap, because I'm going to focus for a second on Staten Island, because Staten Island, right, has one of the more wealthier populations in the city and a very suburban character for most of it, and there's zoning that really limits housing growth in much of the borough, and in fact there's I apologize to Bronxites, I'm going to forget the neighborhood, but there's a particular portion of the Bronx, I think it's Bronx Community District 10, that also has...
So that would be the East Bronx.
Okay, yeah. That also has the same kind of low density growth management.
You are accurate there. I'll be the Bronx guy filling in for you. So there you go. Great. Yes.
Thank you. I need that help.
And that would be a similar landscape to much or some of Staten Island for sure.
Right. So basically, in effect, you're limiting chances for housing growth, housing density, housing supply in those areas because you want to preserve the character. Maybe you don't want to overload infrastructure. But then in other areas, particularly often it seems like in areas that are predominantly minority and low income, you do boost housing growth, and that creates concerns about gentrification and displacement of the low income renters living there. So I think that there are similar issues because, of course, in Staten Island, the area that's being considered for rezoning is Bay Street, which is a predominantly low-income area with people of color, and you could say the same about Jerome Avenue.
We've got about a minute and a half left. You did some writing and some investigation about community land trusts. I thought it was interesting. Why don't you just, as I say, we only have about a minute, but why don't you explain to me what would be relevant to the people in the Bronx as regards community land trusts?
Yeah. So there is a bit of a community land trust movement, I would say, going on in the city right now, in that basically community land trusts are a kind of a way of thinking about land ownership where usually it's like a nonprofit organization that is governed by community residents, and they own land, and they sort of take it out of the speculative market, and they ensure sort of the affordability of the houses on the land, or maybe there's community gardens on the land. It could be anything, but so the city has shown, the de Blasio administration has shown some interest in maybe starting to support this kind of model more, and there's groups such as the Mott Haven Port Morris community land stewards that are trying to adopt this model in the Bronx, and there are other groups trying to adopt it in the rest of the city.
So two real quick follow-up questions, practically yes and no answers. How secure are they in terms of when you have a community land trust, much like a historical district? And number two, does the city push back because it limits their maneuverability if you create a land trust and all of a sudden your options for development are limited? So the first one is, how secure are they once you do make it a land trust?
Well, I guess I would say that it's, if the like a nonprofit, it's mission oriented. So, it could still financially collapse, but because it's mission oriented, it would be sort of.
It gives you a chance. And number two, does the city push back, and is it difficult to get these things done?
Well, I think right now there's a lot of question about whether the city is going to lend enough resources and subsidies to this model, or continue working more with like for-profit developers.
Abigail Savage-Lou from City Limits and zonein.org. You are the best. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know I don't want to hold you up anymore. You better get back to work. There's a lot of zoning reporting to be done. But really, we love having you on the show. And whether we have you here in the studio or from downtown Manhattan, it's just great to have you. Abigail Savage-Lou from City Limits. Thank you so much. Okay, folks, we will be right back. And we'll have Patrick Rocchio from the Bronx Times. Don't go away, please.
From your first sunrise to the sunset of life, we are with you through life's journey. Social Security, securing today and tomorrow. Visit socialsecurity.gov.
This video produced at U.S. taxpayer expense.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bronx Buzz. We had to pull a little switcheroo for technical considerations, and I am thrilled that with us this evening is David Cruz, the editor of the Norwood News. And so we bring David onto the program. We say, hey, David, how are you?
Hi, how you doing, Gary?
Good, thanks for pitching in at the last minute. Before we get into some of the particulars about what's in the paper or going to be in the paper, you told me real briefly that the Norwood News won some awards. So I'm going to editorialize and say well-deserved, even though I don't even know what the awards are. What did you win?
Well, it was at the New York Press Association. They had their annual Better Newspaper Contest Awards, and we had won for in-depth reporting. We had run a third place prize for in-depth reporting and a second place prize for news feature series, and it was focusing on Ved Parkash, the Bronx's worst landlord. And the judges, they seemed to be really, they were very intrigued by the story. They actually thought it was provocatively written, as they said in the pamphlet that we received, and we're pretty proud of that. We were really happy to have actually helped spur some kind of changes. We had written two stories that had gotten a hold of Mr. Parkash, who claimed to have had excellent buildings, but they were in really pretty bad shape. Mm-hmm. And there were protests last year against him, and he actually came and spoke with some of the tenants. So it was very, very interesting to have sort of helped galvanize a little bit of change. I'm
always interested in stuff like that from the reporter's point of view. When you were writing it, and I'm assuming that you wrote the stories and worked on them, were you aware that, wow, this is going really well and maybe we could submit it for an award? Or was it one of those like, wow, I didn't even realize that was such a good story?
Kind of a little bit of both. I mean, the thing is, we were trying to do a story on Mr. Parkash for a long, long time. I mean, he's a pretty notorious landlord in the Bronx. I mean, he's been around the block for at least 20 years, and he was always this very slippery character. And so we had to actually sort through a lot of paperwork to get to his cell phone number, and we managed to actually get him on the phone. And the thing is, we actually began the story with him, and I thought that was a very interesting way of beginning. Most of the time, you'd want to focus on the people who are impacted, but in this case, we sort of did a reverse and actually had him lead the story, claiming that his buildings were excellent. In terms of what... Sorry.
No, go ahead. Finish what you were saying. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Whether or not we were, I don't really think of like these stories over whether or not they're award grabbers. Some stories are, we do them just because, they're stories of the day. But also, when part of the rule of thumb when you're picking a front page story, because these were both the series was part of a front page series, is whether or not it impacts a lot of people. And in this case, it did. I mean, thousands of people are in these buildings that are owned by Parkosh, and so it was, kind of like a good way of highlighting the, I guess, some really nasty conditions in this building.
We probably should identify where those buildings are, how many are in your catchment area, and then I do want to move on to a couple other things.
Well, there are. I mean, the thing is, Parkash owns a lot of buildings, and up and down, mostly on the Grand Concourse. I mean, the closest one to us was on Crescent Avenue off of Kingsbridge Road, and the building was falling apart. There were some bathrooms that had absolutely no ceiling. There was a lot of mold in a lot of these apartments. In one case, there was just like a plant growing out of a ceiling.
That
And
is
so
just that
he
is
thought
so
that-
horrible, David. I have to interject. That is just so unforgivable. It's just horrible.
And the thing is, he actually recently made news again because he was being taken to court, claiming that he was not accepting people with Section 8. So I thought that was really interesting.
Great.
He's
Well,
kind of like the story that keeps on giving.
Yeah, David, congratulations, and to you and mostly you, but the staff in the Norwood News and people who Marshall Preservation Corporation, well deserved, and again, congrats from me. You have a story that is fascinating, and I saw it about a grant that went to, I guess it's PS 80, right? And now they're saying,
Junior high
well,
school.
excuse me.
Junior high school 80. Yeah.
Junior high school 80, I'm sorry. But now they're saying we're taking the grant back. That seems kind of crazy to me. What is that all about?
Well, a state judge had ruled in favor of Junior High School 80 receiving the grant called the Transformational Grant that it had applied for in 2015. The school had been in academic decline for several years, for at least 10 years, and so it was placed on a list of failing schools, not failing enough to actually close them, but to try and get them to reverse themselves, to transform themselves, as the grant implies. And so administrators had applied for this grant, and they received it, but along
How much
the way,
money was it? Can I interject?
it was a little over $3 million.
It's a significant amount of money for a school, yeah.
And so the state gave them the money, but then the state education department removed them from the list, and so that consequently led the budget director to take away the grant. And so the school thought, hey, we already secured this money. It was intended for the 2016-17 school year and the 2017-2018 school year, so what gives? And so they were actually part of a class action lawsuit that this pro bono attorneys took on. They sued the state, and the judge ruled in favor of the school to actually receive the money. But the state can appeal.
Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But that seems like you want to reward people for doing a good job. I understand the grant was awarded because at some point they thought that the school was not doing real well. But if they did well, goodness gracious, let's. And they probably had already earmarked where the monies were to be going. Do we know where the monies were earmarked for and what they were going to spend it on?
Yeah, they were basically going to spend them on more staffing with respect to the time that that classes tend to be extended. They call it extended learning time, and so the money was intended for school guidance counselors during that time period, and also for teachers' aides, also for programming for students who are considered high risk, and other sorts of things. They had a breakdown that was drafted by the principal and other administrators too, and they were really, really depending on this money. Otherwise, they say that the consequences would have been really dire.
Yeah, well, and not only the consequences dire, then what do you think happens? Then the school falls back into a situation where either they're going to close it or it's a failing school, and then they're going to have to go apply for the same money anyway. Let's go. Let's move it forward. That's the way I look at it.
Exactly.
David, both you and I attended, I guess it was a week or two ago, a conference that the borough president ran over development. And for him, he was real excited about $3.2 billion of development in the Bronx over the past year. He was very enthusiastic. I thought it was a very impressive presentation from developers and others talking about investments in our borough. How did you receive what you saw that day?
Well, it was definitely like a positive step for the borough, seeing all that money. Actually, it was a lot higher. The amount of money, 3.2 billion, was higher than the 2015 amount that came in. I think it was around 2.9 billion. But in this latest report, he did include the Kingsbridge Armory, which is $350 million, and yet that project hasn't even begun yet, which was very, very interesting. The fact that he's sort of hedging his bets and assuming that this project, which was marred with all this controversy in court hearings, is actually moving forward. And he included in the report they never did it before, and I guess it shows that they're super confident that the project will be moving forward, even though no shovel was put in the ground in 2016.
I'm going to interpret that a different way, and I was thinking about it while we were both sitting there watching it. In fact, you and I had an interaction because Norwood showed, I think it was Community Board 7, showed the largest investment of any in the Bronx, and that was largely because of the Armory. I was wondering if he did that to kind of try and force the issue. I don't know whether he's confident or not. You'd have to ask them. Whether the borough president's actually confident that the city's going to release the lease. I think it was his way of doing like this to say to the mayor, let's go, let's release the lease and move it forward. And so we're going to put it in our report, and you be the one to take it out of the report. I'm not taking it out of the report. That's my interpretation.
Well, I'm sure that probably politics had played a part in him including it in the
Sure.
report. Although it was interesting too when we did speak with him about it, he was more putting the credit on Cuomo for having included the state loan to the Kingsbridge National Ice Center into the budget, even with all the turmoil that was happening within the state budget over the last week. And so, I mean, clearly, Cuomo is eyeing the Bronx not only for wanting to see it succeed, but also I think he has his own political ambition. And of course, what better way to actually show that you're a leader by showing off your ability to build infrastructure. And so he has physical project. This project is a physical project, and one that he can also take credit for having included it within the budget.
David, you have written some exclusive stories about the Armory and have broken news on the Armory, so I guess you're the right person to ask. What do you think is going to happen here? Do you hear anything? Do you have a sense that the city is going to release the lease and they can finally move this thing forward, according to what the borough president is suggesting? Or do you think it's still being held up?
No, I think the two sides are definitely trying to work on finding some middle ground. The city and lawyers for Koenig are really, right now they're very silent about negotiations. I would imagine that now that the money is actually secured, the city will actually go ahead and start finalizing a lot of the talks, because at this point they were sort of on a holding pattern until they found whether or not Koenig actually had the money. And so remember, the New York City Economic Development Corporation could have easily just said, well, we don't want to pursue this anymore after what the judge had said. And so, we have every right to take away this, to terminate the lease and start from scratch. But a recent statement that I got from the EDC said that the two sides are talking and they're hoping to have like an amicable resolution at the end.
And so the real clue as to what you really believe is to ask you, did you start sharpening your skates yet, or we're still waiting a little bit?
I'm not a very good skater.
You're not a good skater. I don't know how I knew that. Listen, David Cruz, thank you for pitching in. Congratulations on the Press Association Awards. You and the Norwood News are really doing an amazing job. And again, thanks for pitching in with us and giving us some stuff that we wouldn't get anywhere else. We always appreciate what you do.
Thank you, Gary.
All right. We'll see you. Folks, that's going to do it for the Bronx Buzz. We thank both our guests, Abigail Savitz-Lew and David Cruz from the Norwood News. And we and you will get together again next week for the Bronx Buzz. Also, we'll see you on Bronx Talk, of course, beginning Monday nights. Good night.